In the dusty frontier town of Esperanza, where survival meant everything and kindness was a luxury few could afford, Martha Clearwater stood 6 feet tall and weighed more than most men. They called her Big Martha in her back, but never to her face. She ran the only tavern that served hot meals, her hands strong enough to toss a drunk through the door and gentle enough to tend a child's fever. On a moonless October night in 1878, a figure stumbled through her doorway, hollow-eyed, starving, wearing torn Apache clothing but cast out from his people. The townspeople would have shot him on sight. Instead, Martha set down a plate of stew and spoke the words that would change everything. "You need food, and I need love." What happens when two outcasts find each other in a world determined to keep them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Clearwater had learned long ago that the world judged a woman by the space she occupied, and she occupied considerable space indeed. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as a barn door and hands that could snap a man's wrist without effort, she commanded attention wherever she walked through Esperanza's dusty streets. The children would peek from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed with fascination and fear, while the men tipped their hats with grudging respect. The women whispered. She had stopped caring about the whispers years ago, around the time Thomas died and left her alone to run the Clearwater Tavern. That was 1873, 5 long years of serving meals to miners and drifters, of breaking up fights with nothing but her presence and a stern word, of sleeping alone in the bed she had once shared with the only man who had ever looked at her with genuine love, rather than curiosity or fear. The tavern sat at the heart of Esperanza like a weathered oak, its timber walls darkened by years of wood smoke and tobacco. Martha had inherited it from Thomas's father, along with the cast-iron skillet that hung above the kitchen hearth like a shield of honor. That skillet had served 3 generations of Clearwaters, cooking countless meals and, when necessary, serving as a formidable weapon. Martha kept it seasoned with bacon grease and memories, the metal smooth as glass from decades of use. Every morning before dawn, she would light the fires and begin preparing for the day ahead. Biscuits from scratch, bacon thick as a man's thumb, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The ritual grounded her, gave purpose to hands that ached for something more than work. She wore Thomas's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the gold band resting against her heart like a talisman against loneliness. Thomas Clearwater had been a good man, gentle despite his size, with calloused hands that could gentle a spooked horse or trace the curve of her cheek with surprising tenderness. He had courted her when no other man would, seeing beauty where others saw only "Martha," he would say, his voice soft as Sunday morning, "you're not too much woman for this world. This world just ain't enough for you." He died in a mining accident, crushed under a ton of rock, while trying to save 3 men trapped in a cave-in. Martha had identified his body by his hands, those gentle, capable hands that would never touch her face again. The preacher spoke of God's plan and eternal rest, but Martha heard only the howling emptiness that stretched ahead of her like an endless prairie. The townspeople of Esperanza had rallied around her initially, bringing casseroles and condolences, offering help with the tavern. But grief made Martha harder, more formidable than before. She learned to project strength, like armor, to make her very presence a declaration that she needed nothing from anyone. The offers of help dwindled, then stopped altogether. The casseroles ceased coming. Martha was left alone with her grief, her tavern, and her reputation as a woman who could handle anything life threw at her. Sheriff Coleman was one of the few men in town who treated Martha as more than a curiosity. Jake Coleman stood barely 5 feet 6 inches in his boots, but he carried authority like a man twice his size. He had known Thomas, had respected him, and that respect extended to Martha by association. Every Tuesday, he would stop by for coffee and Martha's famous apple pie, discussing town business and sharing the occasional joke. "Martha," he would say, settling his slight frame into the chair that groaned under most men's weight. "You're the backbone of this town, you know that." She did know it, though she took little pleasure in the knowledge. The Clearwater Tavern served as more than a place to eat and drink. It was the unofficial town hall, the place where disputes were settled and news was shared. Martha had overseen handshake business deals worth thousands of dollars, had provided sanctuary for battered wives, had fed families too proud to admit they were hungry. Her establishment was neutral ground, a place where conflicts were checked at the door along with guns and harsh words. Jeremiah Hayes, the town's only physician, was another regular customer. A scholarly man in his 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, he appreciated both Martha's cooking and her practical wisdom. He had delivered half the babies in Esperanza and patched up the other half when they got into trouble. His medical bag was as familiar a sight in the tavern as Martha's cast-iron skillet. "You have healing hands, Martha," Hayes had told her once, watching her tend to a child's scraped knee with gentle efficiency. "You should consider studying medicine." Martha had laughed at the suggestion, but not unkindly. "Doc, I'm 43 years old and built like a freight wagon. Ain't nobody wanting a doctress who looks like she could wrestle a bear." "Their loss," Dr. Hayes had replied, and Martha suspected he meant it. Then there was Mrs. Abigail Patterson, the town's self-appointed moral authority and chief gossip. A thin, sharp-featured woman with eyes like a hawk and a tongue like a whip, she made it her business to know everyone else's business. Her husband owned the general store, which gave her access to every piece of information that flowed through Esperanza. She collected secrets like other women collected recipes, trading them for influence and social standing. Mrs. Patterson tolerated Martha because the tavern was essential to the town's economy, but she never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of Martha's unmarried state, her unfeminine occupation, and her generally unsuitable nature. "It's not natural," she would whisper to her circle of like-minded women. "A woman of her size, living alone, handling men's business. The Lord made women to be helpmeets, not whatever Martha Clearwater has made herself into." Martha heard the whispers. Of course, in a town the size of Esperanza, secrets were as rare as snow in July. But she had armor now, forged from grief and loneliness and the daily necessity of survival. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She had work to do. The work defined her days and gave structure to her solitude. Up before dawn, to start the fires, preparing food that would nourish bodies and sometimes souls. She knew her customers' preferences by heart. Sheriff Coleman liked his eggs over easy, with a dash of hot sauce. Hayes preferred his coffee black as midnight. Old Pete Morrison always ordered the same beef stew and cornbread combination he had been eating for 20 years. Martha took pride in feeding people well. Food was love made manifest, care translated into something tangible and nourishing. Every biscuit was a small act of defiance against a harsh world, every bowl of stew a declaration that comfort still existed, even in a place as hard-scrabble as Esperanza. The tavern operated from sunrise to midnight, serving breakfast to miners heading out for their shifts, lunch to merchants and settlers, dinner to families and bachelors alike. Martha worked alone most days, though she occasionally hired help during busy periods. She preferred solitude to incompetence, and few people could match her standards for cleanliness, efficiency, and quality. Evening brought its own rhythm to the Clearwater Tavern. The miners would return, covered in dust and desperate for strong drink and hot food. Card games would form in the corners, money changing hands with the predictability of sunrise. Martha allowed gambling but kept it civilized, her mere presence enough to discourage cheating or violence. She had developed an instinct for trouble, could sense brewing conflict like a storm on the horizon. A harsh word here, a suspicious glance there, the subtle shift in posture that preceded violence. When necessary, she would intervene with quiet authority, her voice carrying across the room like distant thunder. "Gentlemen," she would say, not raising her voice but somehow making it fill every corner of the tavern. "I run a peaceful establishment. You can settle your differences outside or not at all, but you'll do it away from my tables and paying customers." It was a rare man who chose to test Martha Clearwater's resolve. Those who did usually found themselves deposited on the street with surprising gentleness, their pride intact, but their lesson learned. Martha had never seriously hurt anyone, but her reputation for being able to do so kept order better than any sheriff's badge. The cast-iron skillet had become something of a legend in its own right, hanging above the kitchen hearth where everyone could see it, seasoned to a perfect black sheen. It represented Martha's dual nature more clearly than any words could express. Nourishment and protection, care and strength, the feminine and the formidable united in one practical tool. Thomas had given her that skillet as a wedding gift, though it had belonged to his family for generations. "Every home needs a good skillet," he had said with his gentle smile, "and every skillet needs a good woman to wield it." Martha had used it to cook their first meal as husband and wife, had dreamed of using it to prepare food for their children. But children never came, and Thomas was gone. And now the skillet served a different purpose entirely. It was weapon and tool, symbol and practical necessity, a reminder that survival sometimes required both nurturing and force. As October nights grew longer and colder, Martha found herself spending more time by the kitchen fire, the cast-iron skillet reflecting the flames like a dark mirror. She would sit in Thomas's old chair, mending or reading, listening to the wind whistle through the town's wooden buildings. The loneliness felt heavier during these quiet hours, settling on her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome blanket. She had long ago stopped hoping for companionship. At 43, past the age when most women had established their families, too formidable for most men's comfort, too independent for society's approval, Martha had accepted solitude as her permanent condition. She had her work, her reputation, her small place in the community's life. It would have to be enough. But acceptance and contentment were different things entirely. Martha understood the distinction intimately, felt it in the hollow spaces between her ribs, in the silence that filled her living quarters above the tavern. She was respected, even feared, but she was not loved. Had not been loved since Thomas died, and took her heart with him into the ground. The chain around her neck grew heavier with each passing season. Thomas's ring a constant reminder of what she had lost and would never find again. In a town like Esperanza, where survival depended on strength and practicality, there was little room for a woman who combined both in such overwhelming measure. Men wanted wives who made them feel protective and important. Martha made most men feel small and unnecessary. She had made peace with her circumstances, or told herself she had. The Clearwater Tavern needed her. The town, in its way, needed her. That had to be enough purpose for one life, even if it left her heart as empty as a drought-stricken well. On this particular October night, as Martha banked the kitchen fires and prepared to close the tavern, she had no premonition that everything was about to change. No sense that destiny was stumbling through the darkness toward her door, hollow-eyed and desperate, carrying secrets that would shake the very foundations of the only world she had ever known. The wind picked up as she extinguished the last lamp, rattling the windows and sending dust swirling down Esperanza's main street. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild and full of yearning. Martha Clearwater climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom, Thomas's ring heavy against her chest, and prepared to face another night of dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, cooking, cleaning, serving, enduring. It was a good life by most measures, a useful life, a life that mattered to the people of Esperanza. It was also a life slowly suffocating her with its predictable emptiness. But change was coming to the Clearwater Tavern, approaching on unsteady legs through the desert darkness. Change wearing torn Apache clothing and carrying wounds that went far deeper than flesh. Change that would force Martha to choose between the safety of solitude and the terrifying possibility of love. The cast-iron skillet hung silent above the cold hearth, waiting. The man who would change everything had been walking for 3 days without food, and death walked beside him like a patient companion. His name was Ayana, though few had spoken it with kindness in recent months. In the Apache tongue it meant eternal blossom, a name given to him by his grandmother when he was small and the world still held promise. Now, at 28, he felt as withered as desert sage, his spirit as cracked and barren as the hardpan beneath his bleeding feet. His medicine pouch, torn during his escape from the last settlement that had tried to kill him, hung from his belt like a wounded bird. The sacred items within rattled with each labored step, turquoise and obsidian, and an eagle feather that had once belonged to his grandfather. The pouch should have been whole, should have been carried with reverence and pride. Instead, it was as broken as everything else in his life, its leather split and stained with his own blood. Ayana had been cast out from two worlds, belonging fully to neither. His Apache heritage marked him for death among the white settlements, while his refusal to raid innocent families had earned him exile from his own people. He existed in the space between civilizations, a man without a tribe, without a home, without hope of redemption from either side of the great divide that split the territory like an open wound. The lights of Esperanza flickered ahead like fallen stars, promising warmth and food, and the kind of rest that only came from having walls between oneself and the darkness. Ayana knew better than to hope. Towns meant men with guns, meant fear and hatred, and the kind of violence that asked no questions before pulling triggers. But his body was failing, his vision blurring at the edges, and even a quick death might be preferable to the slow dissolution that awaited him in the desert. He had been the son of Chief Nalnish of the Cherokee, raised to be a warrior and leader among his people. His childhood had been spent learning the ways of the hunt, the paths of the spirits, the sacred responsibilities that bound a man to his tribe and his tribe to the land. His father had been a war chief of great renown, his mother a woman of healing, who could sing broken bones back to wholeness and coax medicine from the most stubborn desert plants. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying like streams in drought. The white soldiers came in greater numbers each year, building their forts and towns on sacred ground, driving away the buffalo and the elk that had sustained the Apache for countless generations. Some among his people wanted war, total war, the kind of fighting that would not end until one side or the other was completely destroyed. Ayana had seen what such wars brought. He had witnessed the aftermath of raids on settler families, had looked into the eyes of children made orphans by Apache fury. He had also seen what the soldiers did to Apache villages, the way they made no distinction between warrior and grandmother, between threat and innocent. Both sides were drowning in blood, and each act of vengeance only deepened the crimson tide. When the War Council demanded he lead raids against the wagon trains that passed through the territory, Ayana had spoken against it, not from cowardice but from a growing certainty that such actions would only bring greater suffering to his people. The white men had numbers and weapons, and a hunger for land that seemed bottomless. War would end only in the complete destruction of the Apache way of life. His words had been branded as weakness, his caution labeled cowardice, when he refused direct orders to attack a settler family with young children. The council stripped him of his status and banished him from the tribe. "You are no longer Apache," his own father had declared, the words cutting deeper than any blade. "Find your place among the white eyes you seem to love more than your own blood." But the white settlements offered no sanctuary. His skin marked him as enemy, his heritage a death sentence that followed him from town to town. He had tried to find work as a guide or translator, offering skills that might bridge the gap between worlds. Instead, he found only suspicion and violence, men who shot first and asked questions of corpses. The broken medicine pouch bounced against his hip with each stumbling step, its torn leather a physical manifestation of his spiritual state. Inside were the sacred objects that connected him to his ancestors, to the spiritual world that gave meaning to Apache existence. But the pouch was damaged, its power compromised, just as Ayana himself had been broken by his exile from everything that had once defined him. He could smell wood smoke now, and something else that made his empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. Cooking food, real food, the kind prepared in kitchens with love and skill rather than grabbed raw from the desert floor. His mouth watered so intensely it hurt, his body betraying the depth of his starvation with embarrassing urgency. Esperanza was smaller than some of the towns he had tried to enter, its buildings low and weathered, its streets empty in the late hour. Most settlements this size would have a saloon or tavern, somewhere a man might beg for scraps or work for a meal. Ayana knew he looked like death walking, knew his appearance would frighten anyone who saw him. But hunger was stronger than pride now, and desperation had a way of stripping away everything but the most basic needs. The Clearwater tavern sat at the town's heart like a beacon, warm light spilling from its windows onto the dusty street. Smoke rose from its chimney, carrying the scent of food that made Ayana's knees weak with longing. He could hear voices inside, the comfortable murmur of people sharing meals and conversation, the kind of human warmth that felt as foreign to him as another planet. He approached slowly, his feet dragging in the dust, his vision swimming with exhaustion and malnutrition. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to find some dark corner where he could die quietly without endangering the innocent people inside that welcoming building. But his body moved forward anyway, driven by needs that transcended rational thought. The door was heavy oak, worn smooth by countless hands. Ayana raised his fist to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of what his appearance must convey. Torn clothing that marked him as Apache, blood on his skin from a dozen small wounds, the hollow-eyed look of a man on the edge of collapse. He would terrify them, these peaceful townspeople. They would see only the savage they expected, not the starving human being beneath the surface. But hunger made the choice for him. His knuckles struck wood in a weak, desperate rhythm that spoke of absolute desperation. The voices inside stilled, and he heard heavy footsteps approaching the door. Masculine footsteps, probably armed, certainly ready for trouble. Ayana closed his eyes and prepared for the violence that had followed him from town to town, like a curse. Instead, the door opened to reveal a woman. She was enormous, nearly as tall as Ayana himself, and built with the solid strength of someone who had never known physical weakness. Her hair was brown, touched with gray, pulled back in a practical style that framed a face that was handsome rather than beautiful, marked by intelligence and something that might have been kindness if Ayana hadn't been so certain he was hallucinating. Martha Clearwater looked down at the broken Apache warrior swaying on her doorstep and saw not a threat, but a fellow creature in desperate need. His eyes held the same hollowness she recognized in her own mirror, the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and was still somehow standing. His torn medicine pouch hung from his belt like a prayer flag in a hurricane, sacred but damaged, meaningful but incomplete. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," she whispered, and caught him as he began to fall. Ayana felt strong arms surround him, felt himself lifted with surprising gentleness despite the woman's obvious power. The world spun and blurred, but he was dimly aware of being carried inside, of warmth and light, and the overwhelming scent of food prepared with care and skill. Voices spoke around him, some concerned, others hostile, but the woman's voice rose above them all. "He's starving," she said, and her tone brooked no argument. "Whatever else he might be, right now he's just a man who needs food and doctoring." Ayana felt himself placed in a chair, felt warm cloth against his face, heard the clink of dishes and the scrape of utensils. When he managed to open his eyes, a bowl sat before him, filled with stew that smelled like salvation. Steam rose from its surface, carrying promises of strength and life and the possibility of surviving another day. The woman, This Amazon who had caught him in his fall sat across from him with her hands folded on the table. Her expression was calm, watchful, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. She studied him with the same intensity he had once brought to tracking game, reading signs that others might miss. "Eat," she said simply. Ayana's hands shook as he lifted the spoon, his coordination compromised by exhaustion and malnutrition. The first taste of the stew nearly brought tears to his eyes. Rich beef, tender vegetables, herbs and seasonings that spoke of skill and care in the cooking. He tried to eat slowly to show proper gratitude, but his body betrayed him with desperate hunger. "Easy," the woman said, her voice gentler now. "It's been a while since you had a proper meal, hasn't it?" Ayana managed to nod, still focused on the miraculous bowl before him. Around them he was dimly aware of other patrons, their conversations resuming, but their attention clearly focused on the drama unfolding at the corner table. He caught fragments of whispered words. "Apache, dangerous. What's Martha thinking?" Martha. So that was her name. It suited her somehow, solid and biblical and uncompromising. She sat watching him eat with the patience of someone accustomed to caring for those in need, her presence a barrier between him and the hostility he could feel, radiating from the other customers. When the bowl was finally empty, Ayana set down his spoon and looked directly at his benefactor for the first time. Her eyes were brown, the color of rich earth, and held depths he couldn't immediately fathom. There was loneliness dead, he recognized, and strength, and something that might have been desperate hope carefully held in check. "Thank you," he managed, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. Martha Clearwater studied the broken Apache warrior who had stumbled into her tavern like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not yet 30, with the kind of natural elegance that even starvation and exhaustion couldn't completely erase. His dark hair was long and matted, his skin marked by sun and hardship, but beneath the damage she could see the man he had been before the world broke him. His medicine pouch drew her attention, torn and stained but still carried with reverence. She had seen Apache artifacts in her years on the frontier to recognize sacred objects when she saw them. This man wasn't just a warrior. He was someone of significance, someone who had lost far more than most people could imagine. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ayana," he replied, and something in the way he said it suggested the name carried weight he was no longer sure he deserved. Martha nodded slowly, tasting the unfamiliar syllables in her mind. Around them, the tavern had grown quiet, customers straining to hear every word of this unprecedented conversation. She was acutely aware of their attention, of the risk she was taking by showing kindness to a man who represented everything they had been taught to fear. "I'm Martha," she said. "Martha Clearwater. This is my place." Ayana's eyes moved around the room, taking in the solid wooden walls, the cast-iron skillet hanging above the hearth, the faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely controlled hostility. He understood immediately that he had been offered more than food. This woman had claimed responsibility for him, at least temporarily, in a place where such protection came with significant cost. "I should go," he said, starting to rise on unsteady legs. "Sit," Martha commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You can barely stand, and it's cold out there. Finish getting your strength back before you decide what comes next." She stood and moved to the kitchen, returning with a cup of coffee that steamed in the lamplight. The simple gesture felt monumental to Ayana, who had grown accustomed to doors slammed in his face and guns pointed at his chest. Kindness had become so foreign that he hardly knew how to receive it. "Martha," Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the whispers like a blade through silk. He had risen from his seat at the bar and was approaching their table with the careful, measured steps of a man trying to defuse a dangerous situation. "Might I have a word?" Martha looked up at the sheriff. This good man who had been one of the few to treat her with consistent respect and kindness. She could see the concern in his eyes, the genuine worry for her safety and reputation. Jake Coleman was trying to protect her, just as he had tried to protect Thomas all those years ago. "You can have your word right here, Jake," she said, not moving from her chair. "I've got nothing to hide." The sheriff glanced at Ayanna, who had gone very still, his hands flat on the table surface, as if preparing to spring into action. The Apache warrior's posture spoke of a man accustomed to violence, ready for it even in his weakened state. But there was something else there too, a quality of resignation that suggested he had been expecting this confrontation from the moment he walked through the door. "Ma'am, I understand you want to help someone in need," Sheriff Coleman said carefully. "That's admirable, it truly is. But you've got to consider the safety of everyone in this establishment. Apache and settlers, well, we're at war. Has been that way for years now." "This man isn't at war with anyone," Martha replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Look at him, Jake. Really look. Does he look like he's been raiding and fighting? He's half dead from hunger and exhaustion. When's the last time you saw a war party of one?" Ayanna finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the now silent tavern. "The sheriff is right to be concerned. My presence here puts everyone at risk. I should go." He started to rise again, his movements slow and careful, but Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The contact sent a shock through both of them, skin against skin across the divide that was supposed to separate their worlds forever. His hand was warm, despite his obvious exhaustion, killust from years of hard work and harder living. "Stay," she said simply. Miss Ayanna stared at her in amazement. This woman who was willing to risk everything to offer him what no one else had given him in months: acceptance. The broken medicine pouch at his side seemed to rattle with renewed life, as if the sacred objects within were responding to the possibility of hope. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said quietly. "The danger you're inviting." Martha smiled then, the first genuine smile that had crossed her face in years. It transformed her entire appearance, revealing the beauty that had been hidden beneath layers of loneliness and defensive strength. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I understand loneliness. I understand what it means to be cast out from where you belong. And I understand that sometimes you have to risk everything for the chance at something better." She reached across the table again, her large hand covering his smaller one. The contact felt electric, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. "Stay," she said again, "at least until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." Around them, the Clearwater tavern buzzed with whispered conversations and shocked speculation. The kitchen table, witness to so many important moments in Martha's life, bore the weight of yet another pivotal decision. But for the first time in 5 years, Martha Clearwater felt truly alive, her heart beating with purpose and possibility. Ayanna looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her pale skin and his darker complexion, and felt something shift inside his chest. Hope, perhaps, or the faint stirring of something that might grow into hope if given time and care. "I will stay," he said quietly. "For now, I will stay." The word sealed a bargain that neither of them fully understood, an agreement that would test everything they thought they knew about love, survival, and the possibility of finding home in the most unlikely places. The kitchen table held their joined hands like a sacred altar, blessing a union that defied every social convention of their time and place. Miss Patterson's lace curtains had been purchased from a traveling merchant 3 years prior, delicate white fabric imported from back east at considerable expense. She had hung them in the front window of her parlor, with great ceremony, declaring them the finest window dressing in all of Esperanza. The curtains served a dual purpose. They proclaimed her family's prosperity and refinement, while providing the perfect vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings of the entire town. Now, barely 12 hours after the shocking events at the Clearwater Tavern, those pristine curtains twitched with unusual frequency as Mrs. Patterson maintained her vigil behind them. Her sharp eyes tracked every movement along Main Street, cataloging details that would fuel weeks of gossip and speculation. The curtains had become the physical manifestation of the town's collective scrutiny, a symbol of the judgment and surveillance that would now follow Martha's every step. Word of Martha's declaration had spread through Esperanza like wildfire through dry grass. By dawn, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard some version of the story, each retelling adding new layers of scandal and speculation. The Apache warrior, the shocking proposition, the public defiance of social convention, all of it filtered through the lens of frontier prejudice and moral outrage. Miss Patterson held court from her parlor, receiving a steady stream of visitors who came ostensibly to borrow sugar or discuss church business, but really to share in the delicious horror of the situation. Her voice carried clearly through the thin walls, each word calculated to inflame passions and solidify opposition to Martha's unprecedented decision. "I've known Martha Clearwater for 15 years, she declared to Miss Henderson, the minister's wife, while her curtains provided perfect surveillance of the tavern across the street. "Always been peculiar, of course, what with her size and that mannish way she has about her. But this goes beyond peculiar, into something approaching madness." Miss Henderson, a thin woman with nervous hands and a tendency to defer to stronger personalities, nodded eagerly. "It's unnatural, certainly. A Christian woman taking in a heathen savage. What would poor Thomas say if he could see what's become of his widow?" "Thomas was too gentle for his own good," Mrs. Patterson replied with the authority of someone who had never particularly liked the deceased, but wouldn't speak ill of him directly. "Always saw the best in people, even when common sense should have warned him otherwise. I fear he left Martha without proper guidance in these matters." Through her precious curtains, Mrs. Patterson watched as Dr. Hayes emerged from the tavern, his medical bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. The physician had spent the night tending to the Apache warrior, a fact that had already generated considerable discussion among the town's more conservative elements. That a respected professional would dignify a savage with medical treatment was almost as scandalous as Martha's initial act of charity. "There's the doctor now," Mrs. Patterson announced, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Spent the entire night in that place, tending to that creature as if he were a civilized person. Mark my words, this will not end well." The truth was more complex than Mrs. Patterson's gossip mill could accommodate. Hayes had indeed spent the night at the tavern, but not solely for medical reasons. The scholarly physician possessed one of the few genuinely curious minds in Esperanza, and the opportunity to communicate with an Apache warrior of obvious intelligence and education was too valuable to waste on prejudice. During the long hours of the night as Ayana recovered from his ordeal, Dr. Hayes had engaged him in careful conversation. What he discovered challenged many of his assumptions about Apache culture and individual capability. The warrior spoke 3 languages fluently, possessed an extensive knowledge of desert medicine and survival techniques, and demonstrated a moral complexity that defied the simple savage stereotype that dominated frontier thinking. "War medical knowledge is impressive," Dr. Hayes had told Ayana around midnight, as they discussed the healing properties of various desert plants. "Your people's understanding of natural remedies far exceeds what we learn in medical school." Ayana had smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of pleasure Dr. Hayes had seen from him. "My mother was a healer. She taught me that all healing begins with understanding the whole person, not just their wounds." Such conversations would never find their way into Mrs. Patterson's gossip sessions, of course. The complexity of truth rarely survived the simplification required for moral outrage. It was easier to maintain clear categories of good and evil, civilized and savage, proper and improper, than to grapple with the messy realities of individual human experience. Martha emerged from the tavern just after sunrise, carrying herself with the same dignified bearing that had always characterized her public appearances. But those watching closely could see subtle changes, a certain lightness in her step, a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for years. The loneliness that had weighed on her shoulders like a physical burden seemed diminished, as if sharing it had somehow lessened its power. She walked to the general store with purposeful strides, her shopping list longer than usual. Word had spread that she was preparing to feed 2 people now, and every item she purchased would be scrutinized for significance. Extra coffee, additional meat, supplies that spoke of a household expanded beyond its normal boundaries. Mr. Patterson, Miss Patterson's long-suffering husband, served Martha with his usual polite efficiency, but his discomfort was obvious. The general store had always been neutral territory, a place where business superseded personal judgment, but the current situation strained even that commercial courtesy. "Morning, Martha," he said carefully, weighing out flour with mathematical precision. "Heard you had some excitement at the tavern last night." "Nothing I couldn't handle, Charles," Martha replied evenly, her tone discouraging further inquiry. But Patterson pressed on, driven perhaps by his wife's expectations or his own genuine concern. "Martha, I've known you since you and Thomas first came to town. You're a good woman, a strong woman. But this could bring trouble on all of us. Apache don't forget grudges, and they don't forgive whites who interfere with their people." Martha set her jaw, recognizing the genuine worry beneath his words. Charles Patterson was not a bad man, simply a cautious one, and his fears were not entirely unreasonable. Apache war parties had indeed been active in the territory, and the complex politics of tribal relations were beyond most settlers' understanding. "The man in my tavern isn't part of any war party," she said firmly. "He's been cast out from his people, same as I've been cast out from proper society by my size and circumstances. Sometimes the unwanted have to look after each other." Her words carried across the store, reaching the ears of other early customers who had come as much for information as for supplies. Martha's public defense of her position would be repeated and analyzed throughout the day, adding new fuel to the controversy that was dividing the town into opposing camps. Back at the tavern, Ayana had awakened to find himself in a real bed for the first time in months. Martha had given him the small room behind the kitchen, a space normally reserved for storage, but hastily converted into basic sleeping quarters. The gesture represented more than simple hospitality. It was a declaration of his place in her household, temporary though it might be. His broken medicine pouch lay on the rough wooden nightstand beside the bed, its torn leather a constant reminder of his displaced status. But for the first time since his exile, the sacred objects within seemed to whisper of possibility rather than loss. The turquoise caught the morning light streaming through the small window, the obsidian reflected hope along with shadow, and the eagle feather stirred with something that felt like blessing. Ayana dressed carefully, aware that his every movement would be watched and judged by the townspeople. His Apache clothing marked him clearly, but Martha had found him a clean shirt that had belonged to Thomas, the fabric soft from years of washing and wear. The gesture touched him deeply. She was clothing him in her dead husband's garments, acknowledging him as worthy of such intimacy. When he emerged from the small room, he found Martha already at work in the kitchen, her movements efficient and purposeful as she prepared breakfast for the early customers who comprised the tavern's regular clientele. She looked up as he entered, and their eyes met across the familiar space with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Good morning," she said simply, but the words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. "Good morning," he replied, unsure of his role in this new dynamic. Martha studied his appearance, noting the way Thomas's shirt fit his leaner frame, the careful way he held himself despite his obvious exhaustion. "You'll help me with the work," she declared, not asking but stating a fact. "Can't have people saying I'm keeping you as a pet or a curiosity. You'll earn your place here, same as anyone else." The practicality of her approach impressed him. By putting him to work, she was diffusing some of the criticism that would inevitably come. He wouldn't be a charity case or a dangerous exotic. He would be a working member of the household, contributing his skills and labor to the tavern's operation. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Martha handed him an apron, another symbolic gesture that spoke volumes about her expectations. "Start with helping me serve breakfast. People need to see that you're capable of more than raiding and fighting. Show them the man you really are, not the savage they expect. The first test came within the hour, when Sheriff Coleman arrived for his usual morning coffee and biscuits. The lawman's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes tracked Ayana's every movement as the Apache warrior served him with quiet efficiency. Other customers watched the interaction with fascination, waiting for violence or confrontation that never materialized. "Coffee's good," Sheriff Coleman said finally, his words carrying more significance than their simple content suggested. Ayana nodded respectfully. "Martha is an excellent teacher." The exchange was brief, but meaningful. By acknowledging Martha's instruction and the Apache's learning, both men had navigated a moment of potential conflict with grace and dignity. It was a small victory, but victories were measured differently in places like Esperanza. Throughout the morning, similar scenes played out as regular customers encountered the new reality of the Clearwater tavern. Some left immediately, unwilling to share space with an Apache regardless of circumstances. Others stayed but watched warily, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. But a few, led by Dr. Hayes's example and Sheriff Coleman's cautious acceptance, began to interact with Ayana as they would any other person serving their meals. The work suited Ayana surprisingly well. His years of training in Apache hospitality customs had taught him to anticipate needs and serve others with grace and efficiency. His movements in the kitchen were economical and precise, and his interactions with customers were marked by a quiet dignity that gradually began to disarm even the most prejudiced observers. But outside the tavern's walls, opposition was crystallizing around Miss Patterson's lace curtains and the moral certainty they represented. A delegation of the town's most prominent citizens was forming, led by Mrs. Patterson herself and including several local businessmen who feared the economic impact of harboring an Apache in their midst. "This cannot be allowed to continue," Mrs. Patterson declared to her growing circle of supporters. "Martha may be willing to risk her own safety and reputation, but she has no right to endanger the rest of us. That savage could be gathering information for a war party. He could be planning to murder us all in our beds." Such fears, while rooted more in prejudice than logic, carried real weight in a community that had lived with the constant threat of Apache raids for years. The fact that Ayana had been cast out from his own people for refusing to participate in such raids was a nuance lost in the broader narrative of fear and suspicion. The growing tension was palpable by midday, when a group of armed men gathered outside the general store, their conversation animated and their intentions unclear. Martha, returning from her errands, noted their presence with growing concern. She recognized the signs of mob mentality beginning to form, the way individual fears could coalesce into collective action. Inside the tavern, Ayana sensed the change in atmosphere before Martha could warn him. His warrior's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, detected the subtle shifts in body language and vocal tone that preceded violence. He set down the plate he had been clearing and moved closer to Martha, his posture defensive, but not aggressive. "The gathering," he said quietly. Martha nodded grimly. "I see them. I should go," Ayana said, echoing his words from the previous evening. "My presence here brings danger to you and everyone else." But Martha's response was the same as before, delivered with even greater conviction. "Running won't solve anything. It'll just confirm their worst assumptions and make the next person who tries to show kindness think twice about it." She moved to the window and looked out at the growing crowd, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. Miss Patterson's lace curtains twitched across the street, and Martha could see the older woman's face pressed against the glass, watching the drama unfold with obvious satisfaction. "Besides," Martha added, turning back to face Ayana, "you're not the only one taking risks here. I've got something invested in this arrangement too." The afternoon sun slanted through the tavern's windows, casting long shadows across the floor, where Martha and Ayana stood, facing an uncertain future. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and Miss Patterson's curtains continued their restless dance, witnessing the birth of a conflict that would test everything both communities thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the possibility of love, transcending the boundaries of race and prejudice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Esperanza to choose between the safety of familiar hatred and the dangerous hope of understanding, and at the center of it all, a broken Apache warrior and a lonely white woman discovered that sometimes the most radical act of all was simply choosing to care about someone the world insisted you should fear. The war lance had been crafted by Ayana's grandfather in the old way, its shaft carved from mountain ash and decorated with eagle feathers, earned through acts of courage and wisdom. The obsidian point had been knapped by his father's own hands, each careful strike of stone against stone, creating an edge sharper than any white man's steel. Sacred symbols were burned into the wood, telling the story of victories won and enemies honored, of the spiritual power that flowed through the weapon when wielded by a true warrior. Now it lay hidden in Martha's cellar, wrapped in oiled cloth and concealed behind barrels of flour and preserved vegetables. Ayana had retrieved it 3 nights ago, slipping out under cover of darkness to recover the lance from its hiding place in the desert where he had cached it before approaching Esperanza. The weapon represented everything he had been forced to abandon, yet he could not bring himself to leave it behind forever. Martha had discovered the lance by accident, searching the cellar for supplies and finding the carefully wrapped bundle tucked away like a guilty secret. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught at the beauty and obvious power of the weapon. This was not some crude tool of violence, but a work of art, a sacred object that spoke of traditions older than any white settlement in the territory. "It belonged to your father," she said when she confronted Ayana about it, holding the lance with the reverence she might show a piece from her own family's history. "My grandfather made it," Ayana replied, his voice heavy with memory. "My father carried it in the war against the Bluecoats, the soldiers who drove our people from the sacred mountains. It should have passed to me when I became a war leader. Instead, it will die with me, forgotten in a white woman's cellar." The bitterness in his voice cut Martha deeply. She understood loss, understood what it meant to be separated from the things that gave life meaning and purpose. But Ayana's losses went beyond the personal into something larger, the destruction of an entire way of life that had sustained his people for countless generations. "Tell me about him," she said gently. "Your father." It was evening, 3 days after Ayana's arrival, and they sat in the kitchen after closing the tavern to paying customers. The routine they had developed felt natural now, almost domestic in its comfortable rhythm. Ayana had proven himself a capable worker, learning the tavern's operations with quick intelligence and applying himself to every task with quiet dedication. More importantly, his presence had begun to change the atmosphere of the establishment in subtle but significant ways. His natural grace and dignity gradually won over some of the more fair-minded customers, while his obvious respect for Martha and her property dispelled the worst fears about savage behavior. It was a delicate process, like taming a wild animal or coaxing a flower to bloom in hostile soil, but progress was unmistakable. "My father was Chief Nalnish of the Chiricahua," Ayana began, his eyes distant with memory. "Strong Thunder," the whites called him, though they never understood the true meaning of his name. He was a war leader, yes, but also a keeper of the old stories, a man who could speak to the spirits that live in the mountains and the desert. Martha poured coffee for both of them, the familiar ritual providing comfort and structure to their conversation. The cast-iron skillet hung above them, witness to this sharing of intimate histories, this building of trust between two people who had every reason to mistrust each other. "He taught me to hunt, to track, to read the signs that the land offers to those who know how to see them," Ayana continued. "But more than that, he taught me to think beyond the immediate moment, to consider the consequences of every action for 7 generations into the future. That wisdom guided the Apache for longer than anyone can remember." "What happened to him?" Martha asked, though she suspected the answer would be painful. Ayana's hands tightened around his coffee cup. the only outward sign of the emotion building inside him. He died 3 winters ago, fighting a patrol of cavalry that had come too close to our winter camp. He could have escaped, could have lived to fight another day, but there were children behind him, families who needed time to reach safety. He chose to die so that others might live. The nobility of the sacrifice was not lost on Martha, who had seen enough frontier violence to understand the complexities of survival and honor. Ayana's father had made the same choice Thomas had made in that mine collapse, choosing the welfare of others over his own safety. It was a kind of courage that transcended race or culture, the fundamental human capacity for selflessness in the face of mortal danger. The war lance should have been buried with him, Ayana said quietly. That was the proper way, the way our people had always honored their war leaders. But the soldiers took his body, refused to let us perform the death rites. I kept the lance, thinking someday I would find his remains and complete the ceremony. Now it seems like nothing but a relic of a dying world. Martha set down her coffee and looked directly at him, her expression serious, but not without compassion. Maybe the world is changing, but that doesn't mean everything from the old ways has to die. Maybe some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for in different ways. What do you mean? Martha chose her words carefully, aware that she was treading on sacred ground. Your father's war lance represents courage, doesn't it? The willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. You're doing the same thing now in a different way, standing up for peace instead of war, for understanding instead of hatred. Maybe that's how traditions survive, by adapting to new circumstances while keeping their essential truth. Ayana stared at her in surprise, not expecting such insight from someone outside his culture. But Martha had a way of cutting through surface differences to find the deeper currents that connected all human experience. Her loneliness had taught her to see beyond appearances, to recognize the common threads of hope and fear that bound all people together. You think like a shaman, he said wonderingly, like someone who can see the connections between all things. I think like a woman who's had too much time to consider life's complexities, Martha replied with a slight smile. Loneliness either breaks you or makes you wise. Sometimes both. Their conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside, voices raised in animated discussion. Martha moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her expression growing concerned as she took in the scene beyond. A group of men had gathered in the street, their torches casting dancing shadows against the building walls. She recognized most of them. Local businessmen and ranchers, men she had served in her tavern for years, now united by a common purpose that clearly involved her establishment. What is it? Ayana asked, joining her at the window. Trouble, Martha said grimly. The kind of trouble I've been expecting since the first night you walked through that door. The crowd was growing larger, drawing men from their homes and businesses with the irresistible pull of mob mentality. At its center stood Mrs. Patterson, her thin form animated with righteous indignation, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. We cannot allow this abomination to continue, she declared to the assembled men. Martha, Clearwater has lost all sense of propriety and Christian decency. She is harboring a savage in our midst, endangering every family in Esperanza with her misguided charity. Sheriff Coleman was there too, Martha noted, but his position in the crowd suggested he was trying to moderate rather than lead. His hands moved in calming gestures, his voice a counterpoint to Mrs. Patterson's inflammatory rhetoric, though the distance made his words indistinct. They want me to leave, Ayana said, his voice matter-of-fact, despite the gravity of the situation. They want a lot of things, Martha replied. Doesn't mean they're going to get them. She turned from the window to face him, her expression resolute. There's something you need to know about that war lance, about who you really are. I've been hearing things, putting pieces together from conversations with Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Coleman. You're not just any Apache warrior, are you? Ayana went very still, recognizing the shift in Martha's tone that suggested she had discovered something significant. The secret he had been carrying, the knowledge that made his exile even more dangerous and politically complex, was apparently not as well hidden as he had hoped. "What have you learned?" he asked carefully. "You're the son of a chief, Martha. Not just any chief, but one of the most respected war leaders in Apache territory. Your exile wasn't just personal, it was political. There are people among your own tribe who would benefit from your permanent disappearance, people who want war with the whites and see your peaceful approach as a threat to their authority." The accuracy of her deductions stunned Ayana into silence. Martha had indeed been listening carefully to conversations and reading between the lines of what was said and what was carefully not said. Hayes, in particular, had picked up enough clues during their medical discussions to begin understanding the larger implications of Ayana's presence in Esperanza. "If you're right," Ayana said slowly, "then my presence here is even more dangerous than either of us realized. Both sides have reasons to want me dead or discredited. The whites see me as a potential spy or advanced scout for raids. My own people see me as a traitor who might convince other young warriors to abandon the war path." Martha nodded grimly. "Which means we're not just dealing with local prejudice and fear. We're caught in the middle of something much bigger. Something that could explode into violence that would destroy both our communities." Outside, the crowd was growing restless, their torches flickering like angry stars in the darkness. Mrs. Patterson's voice rose above the general murmur, calling for action, for decisive steps to protect the town from the threat she perceived in Ayana's presence. "There's still time for you to leave," Martha said quietly. "I could create a distraction, give you a chance to slip out the back way. You could retrieve your father's war lance and disappear into the desert before anyone realizes you're gone." Ayana considered the offer, weighing the practical advantages of flight against the deeper currents of feeling that had begun to flow between them over the past few days. Leaving would be the sensible choice, the safe choice for both of them. It would allow Martha to resume her normal life, without the burden of controversy and danger his presence created. But it would also mean abandoning something precious that had begun to grow in the unlikely soil of their partnership. Working together in the tavern, sharing meals and conversations, gradually learning to trust and care for each other, they had discovered a connection that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that were supposed to keep them forever apart. "I could leave," he agreed, "but I won't." "Why not?" Martha asked, though she hoped she already knew the answer. Ayana moved closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of flour and coffee that always seemed to cling to her clothes. His broken medicine pouch rested against his hip, its sacred contents whispering of courage and purpose, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. "Because," he said softly, echoing her words from that first night, "you need love. And I need food. But more than that, we need each other. I've been walking alone for too long, Martha. I don't want to walk alone anymore." His words hit her like a physical force, driving home the reality of what had been growing between them. This wasn't just charity or convenience or mutual protection. This was the beginning of something deeper, more dangerous and more precious than either of them had dared to imagine. "Then we face this together," Martha said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, the crowd had begun to move, their torches bobbing as they approached the tavern's front door. Mrs. Patterson's voice rose in a final exhortation, calling on the men of Esperanza to take action before it was too late, before the savage could complete whatever dark purpose had brought him to their peaceful community. But inside the tavern, Martha, Clearwater, and Ayana stood united, their hands clasped as they prepared to defend not just their individual safety but their right to choose love over fear, understanding over hatred, hope over the familiar comfort of prejudice. The war lance lay hidden in the cellar, waiting, but the real battle would be fought with words and courage, and the radical proposition that two people from different worlds could find in each other something worth risking everything to protect. Martha's mother's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its worn leather binding soft with age and countless readings. The pages had yellowed over the decades since her mother's death, and between the tissue-thin leaves were pressed flowers from her wedding day to Thomas, their faded petals still holding traces of color and fragrance after 5 years. Martha had placed them there the day after the funeral, a tangible reminder of love's ability to endure even in the face of loss. Now, as torchlight flickered through the tavern windows and angry voices rose in the street outside, Martha found herself turning to the familiar comfort of her mother's faith. Not the rigid, judgmental Christianity that Miss Patterson wielded like a weapon, but the gentler wisdom her mother had taught her about love, compassion, and the courage to do right even when the world opposed you. "Love thy neighbor as thyself," Martha read aloud, her finger tracing the familiar verse. Seems simple enough, but nobody ever mentions how complicated it gets when you actually try to live by it. Ayana stood at her shoulder, looking down at the ancient text with curious reverence. Apache spiritual traditions were oral rather than written, passed down through generations in songs and stories rather than preserved in books. But he recognized sacred wisdom when he encountered it, regardless of its source or form. "Your holy book speaks of love," he said quietly. "Mine would say the same thing, though the words would be different. My grandmother used to say that the Great Spirit speaks to all people, but each hears the message in their own tongue." Martha smiled at the memory the pressed flowers evoked, her wedding day when she had carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers that Thomas had gathered himself at sunrise. She had been 38 then, old to be a bride by most standards, but Thomas had made her feel like a young girl discovering love for the first time. The flowers in her Bible were all that remained of that perfect day when hope had seemed as natural as breathing. "Thomas gave me these flowers," she told Ayana, touching the fragile petals with gentle fingertips. "Said he wanted to pick them himself so they'd be perfect for the most perfect woman he'd ever known. Course I wasn't perfect, wasn't even close, but love has a way of making us see beauty where others might not." Outside, Sheriff Coleman's voice rose above the crowd's murmur, trying to restore order and reason to a situation rapidly spiraling toward violence. Martha could hear him clearly now, his words carrying the authority of law and the weight of years spent keeping peace in a town that often seemed determined to tear itself apart. "Now hold on, folks," the sheriff was saying. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Martha Clearwater has every right to offer hospitality to anyone she chooses, long as they're not breaking any laws. And far as I can tell, the Apache hasn't done anything wrong since he's been here." Mrs. Patterson's shrill response cut through the night air like a blade. "Not doing anything wrong? Jacob Coleman, that savage, could be planning to murder us all in our beds. Apache don't show mercy to white families, and we'd be fools to show mercy to them. That's enough." Abigail Doc Hayes's voice joined the debate, his scholarly tone a counterpoint to the hysteria building in the crowd. "I've spent time with the man. He's educated, intelligent, and as far from a savage as any person in this town. Judge him by his actions, not by your prejudices." But reason was losing ground to emotion, and Martha could hear the mood of the crowd shifting towards something darker and more dangerous. Fear was a powerful motivator, especially when combined with the righteous certainty that came from years of conditioning about racial superiority and moral authority. "We need to be ready," Martha said quietly, closing her mother's Bible and placing it carefully on the kitchen shelf where it would be safe from whatever violence might follow. "They're not going to listen to reason, not tonight. Fear has them by the throat, and fear makes people do terrible things." Ayana nodded grimly, his warrior's instincts fully alert now. He had faced hostile crowds before, had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence. The tone of voices, the body language of men working themselves up to actions they would never consider in calmer moments. The way individual fears combined and amplified into mob mentality. I could still leave, he offered one final time. Slip out through the cellar, retrieve my father's lance and disappear into the desert. It would end this before anyone gets hurt. Martha turned to face him fully, her expression fierce with determination. And what message would that send? That fear wins. That hatred gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. That love has to hide in the shadows because it makes other people uncomfortable. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the war paint of resolve in her own reflection in his dark eyes. No, Ayana, we've made our choice, and we're going to stand by it. Whatever comes through that door, we face it together. The first heavy knock came at exactly that moment, as if the crowd had been waiting for some invisible signal. Sheriff Coleman's voice followed immediately, carrying the careful formality of official business mixed with personal regret. Martha, it's Jake. I need to talk to you about the situation here. There are some folks who are pretty worked up, and I think it might be best if we could work out some kind of arrangement. Martha and Ayana exchanged glances, both understanding the subtext of the sheriff's words. He was trying to find a middle ground, a way to defuse the situation without bloodshed or permanent damage to the community's social fabric. But compromise would require someone to back down, and Martha had no intention of abandoning the stand she had taken. Come in, Jake, Martha called out, moving to unlock the front door. But understand that my position hasn't changed. Ayana stayed. The sheriff entered alone, his weathered face grim with the weight of trying to balance law, order, and justice in a situation where all three seemed mutually exclusive. Behind him the crowd pressed closer to the doorway, their torches casting wild shadows that danced across the tavern's familiar walls. Martha, I've got 23 men out there, all armed, all convinced that keeping this Apache here is going to bring death and destruction to their families, Sheriff Coleman said without preamble. I've got Dr. Hayes and a few others arguing for reason, but they're outnumbered 3-1. Then you'd better decide which side of this you're on, Jake, Martha replied firmly, because I'm not backing down, not now, not ever. Sheriff Coleman looked at Ayana, taking in the Apache warrior's calm demeanor and dignified bearing. Over the past few days, he had observed the man's behavior carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden aggression. Instead, he had seen only quiet competence, respectful interaction with customers, and obvious devotion to Martha's welfare. I believe you're a good man, he told Ayana directly. I believe you're trying to find a peaceful path in a world that doesn't seem to have much use for peace. But belief doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't calm fears that have been building for years. Ayana inclined his head respectfully. I understand the position you are in, Sheriff. You must protect all the people of this town, not just those who are right. I do not wish to be the cause of violence among neighbors and friends. See? Miss Patterson's voice shrieked from the doorway, where she had pushed her way to the front of the crowd. He admits it. He admits he's the cause of violence. Get him out of here before he brings war parties down on all our heads. But Martha stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the crowd and Ayana, her formidable presence a barrier that even the most aggressive men hesitated to challenge directly. Her hand moved to the cast-iron skillet hanging above the hearth, not quite touching it, but making its availability clear to everyone watching. The only violence here is what you're bringing with your fear and hatred, she declared, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the crowd. This man has done nothing but work honestly, treat people with respect, and try to build a life based on something other than the endless cycle of revenge that has poisoned this territory for decades. Hayes pushed forward from the back of the crowd, his medical bag in hand, and his expression resolute. Martha's right, and you all know it. We've had Apache working in our mines, trading in our stores, even serving as scouts for the army. This man is no different, except that he's chosen to reject the war path entirely. That's what makes him dangerous, Mrs. Patterson shot back. He's a traitor to his own people, which means he can't be trusted by anyone. Today he's peaceful. Tomorrow he could be leading raids against us. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the torches, poisoning the atmosphere with suspicion and doubt. Martha felt the crowd's mood shifting again, moving toward a decision that could destroy everything she and Ayana had begun to build together. "You want to know what makes him dangerous?" Martha asked, her voice rising with passionate conviction. "I'll tell you what makes him dangerous. He's dangerous because he proves that your hate is a choice, not a necessity. He's dangerous because he shows that Apache and whites can work together, can respect each other, can even love each other, if we have the courage to try." The word love hit the crowd like a physical blow, confirming suspicions and fears that had been building since the first night. This wasn't just about charity or hospitality or Christian duty. This was about a white woman and an Apache warrior choosing each other in defiance of every social convention that defined frontier society. "My God," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her thin face pale with shock. "You're in love with him. You're actually in love with that savage." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "Yes," she said simply. "I am. And he loves me, and if that threatens your neat little world, where everyone stays in their proper place and nobody questions the way things have always been, then maybe it's time for that world to change." The admission rippled through the crowd like wildfire, transforming simmering resentment into open outrage. Men who had been content to grumble and threaten now saw their worst fears confirmed. This wasn't just about one Apache warrior. This was about the fundamental order of their society, the racial hierarchies that justified their treatment of native peoples and maintained their sense of superiority and control. But in the midst of the chaos and anger, something unexpected happened. Ayana stepped forward, moving to stand beside Martha rather than behind her, his presence a declaration of partnership that transcended the fear and hatred swirling around them. "She is right," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I do love her. She saved my life, not just with food and shelter, but by showing me that there is still kindness in a world that had taught me to expect only cruelty. If that makes me dangerous to you, then you fear the wrong things." His words, delivered with simple dignity and absolute conviction, seemed to drain some of the venom from the crowd's anger. Here was a man willing to stand up and claim responsibility for his choices, to face whatever consequences came from loving across the racial divide that was supposed to be absolute and eternal. Sheriff Coleman looked between Martha and Ayana, seeing in their united stance something that reminded him of other couples he had known, other partnerships built on mutual respect and shared strength. His own wife had been gone 3 years now, claimed by fever, but he remembered what it felt like to have someone willing to stand beside you against all the world's hostility and doubt. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of resignation, mixed with something that might have been respect, "I guess that settles the question of intent. Question now is what we're going to do about it." The crowd stirred restlessly, waiting for direction, for someone to tell them how to channel their fear and outrage into action. Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth to speak, but before she could voice whatever inflammatory rhetoric she had prepared, another voice cut through the night from Sosmer, beyond the circle of torchlight. "Perhaps," the voice said with cultured precision, "that question should be decided by those with the most at stake in its outcome." All heads turned toward the source of the unexpected interruption, and Martha felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Emerging from the darkness beyond the crowd came a group of Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the flickering light of the settlers' torches. At their head walked a man Martha recognized from Ayana's descriptions, tall and imposing with the bearing of natural command. This could only be one person, Chief Nalnish, Ayana's father, the war leader, who was supposed to be dead but who now stood very much alive in the streets of Esperanza. The pressed flowers in Martha's Bible seemed to whisper of faith rewarded and love triumphant, but the reality facing them now suggested that the real test of their commitment was just beginning. Thomas Clearwater's rifle had been his most prized possession, a Winchester Model 1873 that he had saved for months to purchase from a traveling gun dealer. The weapon hung above the fireplace in Martha's living quarters, cleaned and oiled, but unused since the day she had laid her husband to rest. Thomas had been a peaceful man by nature, but frontier life demanded that even the gentlest souls be prepared to defend what they held dear. Now, as three separate groups of armed men faced each other in the dusty streets of Esperanza, that rifle might be called upon to serve once again. The silence that followed Chief Nalnish's arrival stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Martha could feel the tension radiating from every person present, white and Apache alike, as they processed the implications of this unprecedented gathering. The war chief's presence transformed what had been a local dispute into something far more dangerous, a confrontation that could ignite violence across the entire territory. Ayana stared at the man he had believed dead for 3 years, his face cycling through shock, joy, and terrible understanding. His father stood 20 feet away, alive and commanding as ever. But the years of exile had changed both of them in ways that might prove impossible to bridge. "Father," Ayana said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of grief, anger, and desperate hope. Chief Nalnish studied his son with dark eyes that missed nothing, taking in the white man's clothing, the way Ayana stood protectively beside the towering woman, the obvious bonds of loyalty and affection that had formed between two people who should have been natural enemies. "My son," the chief replied, his voice carefully neutral, "you have been difficult to find." The Apache warriors behind him shifted restlessly, their war paint gleaming in the torchlight, their weapons ready but not yet raised in open threat. Martha recognized the barely controlled aggression in their posture, the way they held themselves like coiled springs, waiting for the word to unleash violence that would sweep away everything in its path. Sheriff Coleman, caught between two armed groups with very different ideas about justice and territorial rights, raised his hands in a gesture of peace while keeping one hand close to his sidearm. "Now, let's everybody stay calm here. We can talk this through without anyone getting hurt." "Talk," Mrs. Patterson said with venomous sarcasm. "Talk with savages who paint themselves for war and come skulking into our town in the dead of night. Sheriff, if you won't protect this community, then we'll have to protect ourselves." Her words triggered a ripple of movement through both groups, hands moving toward weapons, bodies shifting into defensive positions. The delicate balance that had kept violence at bay was crumbling rapidly, and Martha realized that words alone might not be enough to prevent bloodshed. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying the authority that had kept peace in her tavern for 5 years. "Before anyone starts shooting, maybe we should find out why Chief Nalish is here. Seems to me he didn't bring war paint and warriors just to chat about the weather." All eyes turned to the Apache leader, who regarded Martha with interest that was both respectful and calculating. He had heard stories about the white woman who had taken his exiled son into her home, who had defied her own people to offer protection to someone they considered an enemy. Such courage, even from an enemy, demanded recognition. "I came for my son," Chief Nalish said simply. 3 years ago, I spoke words in anger that I have regretted every day since. I declared him dead to our people because he would not follow the war path I believed was necessary for our survival. I was wrong." The admission hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Apache war chiefs did not admit error lightly, especially not in front of enemies. For Nalish to acknowledge his mistake so publicly was a gesture of tremendous significance, one that suggested the situation was far more complex than anyone had realized. "You faked your death," Ayana said, understanding dawning in his voice. "The cavalry patrol, the story of your sacrifice. It was all a lie." "Not a lie," his father corrected gently. "A necessity. There were those among our own people who demanded total war, who would have killed me if they knew I was beginning to question the path we had chosen. My apparent death, allowed me to step back, to watch, to learn. And what I learned is that my son was right. War without end will destroy us all. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale, with the realization that she was witnessing a moment of profound historical significance. This wasn't just a family reunion, or a simple rescue mission. This was a war chief publicly abandoning the path of violence, choosing peace in front of both his enemies and his own warriors. But not everyone was prepared to accept such a dramatic shift. One of the Apache warriors, younger than the others, and marked with the ritual scars of recent battles, stepped forward with obvious agitation. "Great Chief," he said in Apache, his words translated by Ayana for the benefit of the white listeners, "this is not what was agreed. You said we came to retrieve a lost warrior, not to make peace with the people who have stolen our land and murdered our family." Chief Nalnish turned to face the young warrior, his expression stern, but not unkind. "Broken Arrow, you speak from pain and anger, and I understand both. But pain and anger are poor guides when the survival of our people hangs in the balance. Look around you, see what I see." He gestured toward Martha and Ayana, their hands clasped as they faced an uncertain future together. "My son has found something here that war could never give him. Hope, love, the possibility of a future that is not built on the bones of the dead. If we can learn from his example, perhaps there is still time to save both our peoples from the destruction that awaits us on the warpath." The young warrior's face twisted with disgust. "You would have us make peace with the very people who drove us from our sacred places, who killed our children and enslaved our women. There can be no peace with the White Eyes, only victory or death." "And if we choose death," Chief Nalnish asked quietly, "what becomes of our children? What becomes of the wisdom our ancestors passed down through countless generations? Does it die with us in some final, futile battle, or do we find a way to preserve it for those who come after?" The question hung in the air like smoke, challenging everyone present to think beyond the immediate moment, beyond the familiar patterns of violence and revenge that had defined relations between Apache and settler for decades. Martha felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the terrible responsibility of being caught at the center of a moment that could change everything. The rifle hanging in her quarters seemed to call to her, offering the familiar comfort of violence as a solution to an impossibly complex problem. But she thought instead of the pressed flowers in her mother's Bible, of the faith that had sustained her through loss and loneliness, of the love that had bloomed unexpectedly in the most unlikely soil. Sometimes the greatest courage was not in fighting, but in refusing to fight, in choosing hope over fear, even when hope seemed impossible. "Your son saved my life," she said to Chief Nalnish, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Not just with his presence, but with his choice to see me as a person instead of an enemy. If two people from our different worlds can find love, maybe there's hope for peace between our peoples." Hayes stepped forward from the crowd of white settlers, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. "I've been practicing medicine on this frontier for 20 years, he said. "I've treated Apache wounded and white wounded, and I can tell you that blood is the same color no matter what language the patient speaks. We're all human beings, all trying to survive in a harsh land that doesn't care about the color of our skin or the gods we pray to." His words carried weight with both groups, the authority of someone who had seen beyond surface differences to the common humanity that connected all people. Even Mrs. Patterson seemed momentarily silenced by the physician's moral authority. But the moment of potential understanding was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A cavalry patrol, drawn by reports of Apache activity near Esperanza, thundered into view with sabers drawn and rifles ready. Their leader, a young lieutenant with ambitious eyes and a hunger for glory, took in the scene with obvious excitement. "Apache war party," he shouted to his men. "Prepare to engage." The situation exploded into chaos as three groups of armed men suddenly found themselves in a triangular standoff, each seeing the others as threats to be eliminated. The cavalry viewed both the Apache warriors and the armed settlers as obstacles to their mission. The townspeople saw enemies on two fronts. The Apache warriors found themselves surrounded by the very forces that had been hunting them for years. In the center of it all, Martha and Ayana stood together, their love suddenly seeming fragile and impossibly small against the forces of history and hatred that swirled around them. The rifle upstairs called to Martha with increasing urgency, promising the power to defend what she held dear, even if it meant destroying any hope of peace. But as she looked into Ayana's eyes, she saw not defeat, but determination. They had chosen each other despite every obstacle their worlds could place in their path. Now they would face the consequences of that choice together, whatever they might be. The pressed flowers in her Bible had weathered 5 years of grief and loneliness, preserving the memory of love, even in the darkest times. Perhaps love itself possessed that same endurance, that same capacity to survive even when everything else seemed lost. Chief Nalnish raised his hand, and his warriors immediately stilled, their weapons remaining ready, but not raised in open threat. It was a gesture of tremendous leadership, maintaining control over his men even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Lieutenant," he called out to the cavalry officer, his English precise despite the accent, "I am Chief Nalnish of the Cherokapur Apache. I come under a flag of peace to retrieve my son and to discuss terms that might prevent further bloodshed in this territory." The young officer's eyes widened with recognition and ambition. Chief Nalnish was a prize beyond his wildest dreams, a war chief whose capture would guarantee promotion and glory. But the situation was complicated by the presence of civilians and the obvious fact that no one was actively fighting. "You're under arrest," the lieutenant declared, though his voice held less certainty than his words suggested. "All of you Apache are under arrest for trespassing on American soil and threatening American citizens." Threatening. Martha's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The only threatening I see here is coming from you and your soldiers. These Apache came peacefully to talk, and they've offered more wisdom and decency than half the so-called Christians in this town." Her words shifted the dynamic once again, reminding everyone present that this was not a simple matter of good versus evil, civilized versus savage. This was a complex human situation involving people who had made difficult choices and were now trying to find a path forward that didn't require anyone to die. Sheriff Coleman, recognizing his responsibility to protect all the people in his jurisdiction, stepped carefully between the three groups. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your concern for our safety, but these Apache haven't broken any laws that I can see. They came to talk, and as long as they keep talking instead of fighting, I think we should let them." "Sheriff, you're interfering with a military operation," the lieutenant snapped. "No, sir," Coleman replied firmly. "I'm keeping the peace in my town. That's my job, and I intend to do it regardless of who's wearing what uniform or carrying what weapons." The standoff continued, 3 groups of armed men, facing each other, while 2 people who had chosen love over hatred stood at the center of it all, their hands clasped as they waited to see whether the world would allow them to build something beautiful or would tear it apart in service to older, ugly truths. Thomas Clearwater's rifle waited upstairs, ready to serve if called upon. But Martha found herself hoping that love, like the pressed flowers in her Bible, might prove stronger than the violence that had defined the frontier for far too long. The simple wedding ring that the town blacksmith would forge 6 months later did not yet exist, but its promise lived in the space between Martha's outstretched hand and the muzzle of the cavalry lieutenant's pistol. In that frozen moment, as 3 groups of armed men held their breath and waited for someone to make the choice between peace and violence, the future hung balanced on the edge of a blade. Martha had moved without conscious thought, placing herself directly between the young officer and Ayana, her formidable frame a barrier that even military authority had to acknowledge. Her action wasn't strategic or calculated. It was pure instinct, the same protective impulse that had led her to feed a starving Apache warrior 3 weeks ago, despite every social convention that said she should have turned him away. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. Before you start shooting, maybe you should consider what story you'll tell your commanding officer about how you started a war in the middle of a peaceful town. The young officer's face flushed with anger and uncertainty. He had expected glory and promotion from capturing Apache raiders, not this complex situation involving civilians who refused to behave like proper victims. His training had prepared him for clear-cut battles between soldiers and savages, not delicate negotiations involving star-crossed lovers and reformed war chiefs. "Ma'am, step aside," he ordered, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a military matter now." "No," Martha replied simply. "This is a human matter, has been from the beginning." Chief Nalnish watched the exchange with growing respect for the white woman who had claimed his son's heart. Her courage reminded him of the Apache women who had fought beside their warriors in the sacred mountains, who had defended their children with nothing but determination and love. Such bravery transcended race or culture, representing something universal in the human spirit. "My son," he called out in Apache, his words carrying clearly across the tense silence. "Tell me about this woman who stands between you and death." Ayana's response came in English, meant for all to hear. "She is everything I never dared to hope for, Father. She is strength and gentleness, wisdom and courage, loneliness transformed into love. She saved me from despair, and I would die before I let harm come to her." The declaration rippled through both groups, like a stone thrown into still water. Even Mrs., her face pale in the torchlight, seemed struck by the simple sincerity of the words. This was not the brutal passion of savages that her prejudices had prepared her to condemn, but something that sounded disturbingly like the kind of love celebrated in church services and romantic poetry. Hayes, still clutching his medical bag, stepped forward with the careful movements of a man trying to prevent catastrophe. "Lieutenant, I've been a field surgeon with 3 different cavalry units. I've seen what happens when situations like this explode into violence. Win or lose, everybody bleeds. Everybody dies. Is that really what you want to explain to your colonel?" The question forced the young officer to consider consequences beyond his immediate ambitions. A successful capture of Apache raiders would indeed bring promotion and glory, but a massacre involving civilians, even Apache-sympathizing civilians, could end his career and possibly his life. Military justice was harsh when it came to officers who exceeded their authority with disastrous results. Sheriff Coleman, recognizing the lieutenant's hesitation, pressed his advantage. "Son, I've been keeping peace in frontier towns since before you were born. What we've got here isn't a war party or a raid. It's a family trying to heal old wounds. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is know when not to fight." But the young Apache warrior called Broken Arrow had heard enough talk of peace and reconciliation. His own family had been killed in a cavalry raid 2 winters previous, his wife and children murdered while he was away hunting. The sight of white soldiers awakened memories and rage that no amount of reasonable discussion could contain. "Enough," he snarled, raising his rifle toward the cavalry patrol. "They killed my family, burned our sacred places, drove us from the lands our ancestors walked for countless generations. There can be no peace with such people." His movement triggered an immediate response from the soldiers, who raised their own weapons in a familiar pattern of escalation that had ended in blood and sorrow countless times before. The townspeople, caught between 2 groups of armed men who seemed determined to fight, scattered for cover while fumbling for their own weapons. But Chief Nalnish moved faster than any of them, his war lance suddenly appearing in his hands as he stepped between his warrior and the cavalry patrol. The weapon's obsidian point gleamed in the torchlight, its eagle feathers rustling with spiritual power that even the white observers could feel. "Broken Arrow," the chief said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I understand your pain. I have walked the same path of grief and rage that consumes you now. But if we choose violence tonight, we destroy the only hope our people have for a future that is not built on graves." "You speak like an old woman," Broken Arrow spat, though he lowered his rifle slightly out of respect for his chief's position. Like someone who has forgotten what it means to be Apache. I speak like someone who has learned that there are different kinds of strength, Nolnish replied. The strength to kill is easy to find. The strength to preserve life, to choose hope over hatred, to build instead of destroy, that is the strength of true warriors. Martha watched the exchange with growing understanding of the forces at work within the Apache group. This wasn't just about her and Ayana anymore. This was about the direction an entire people would take, whether they would choose the path of endless war that could only end in their destruction, or find some way to adapt and survive in a changing world. The lieutenant, sensing an opportunity in the apparent division among the Apache, raised his pistol again. Chief, order your warriors to surrender their weapons, and we can discuss terms. Otherwise, I'll have to assume hostile intent. Hostile intent, Martha repeated, her voice heavy with irony. Young man, the only hostile intent I see is coming from you and your soldiers. These Apache came here to retrieve a family member and discuss peace. You're the ones who rode in with weapons drawn, ready to start shooting. Her words stung the officer's pride, but they also exposed the fundamental flaw in his position. He had arrived expecting to find a clear military situation, raiders threatening innocent civilians. Instead, he found a complex diplomatic scenario involving parties from multiple communities, all trying to navigate competing interests and loyalties. Ayana, still standing beside Martha with their hands clasped, looked between his father and the woman who had become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. The broken medicine pouch at his hip rattled softly, its sacred contents whispering of traditions that might yet find new expression in this moment of crisis. Father, he said quietly, there is something you should know. Martha and I, we wish to be married, to build a life together that honors both our peoples while belonging fully to neither. If such a thing is possible, the declaration hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Marriage between white and Apache was not just socially unacceptable, it was legally impossible in most territories, a violation of laws designed to preserve racial separation and white supremacy. But laws, like traditions, could be changed by people with sufficient courage and determination. Chief Nalnish studied his son's face, seeing there a peace and happiness that had been absent during the years of exile. The white woman beside Ayana radiated a similar contentment, the kind that came from finding one's proper place in the world after long searching. Such unions have happened before, the chief said carefully, though rarely, and never without great cost to all involved. Are you prepared for a life lived between worlds, belonging fully to neither? We are already living such a life, Martha replied, have been since the first night we chose each other over the expectations of our separate peoples. Marriage would simply make official what already exists in our hearts. Mrs. Patterson, who had been silent since the soldiers arrived, suddenly found her voice again. This is insanity, pure insanity. Marriage between a white woman and an Apache, it's against nature, against God, against everything decent and Christian. But Dr. Hayes, ever the voice of reason, countered her hysteria with scholarly precision. Actually, Abigail, there's nothing in Christian doctrine that specifically forbids such unions. The early church welcomed converts from all races and nations. It's social custom, not divine law, that creates these barriers. The theological debate might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of more approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of additional complications. A larger cavalry force was approaching, drawn by the reports of Apache activity and prepared for a major engagement. Colonel Marcus Webb, a veteran of 20 years of frontier warfare, rode at the head of the column with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too many conflicts end in unnecessary bloodshed. Unlike his ambitious subordinate, Webb understood that lasting peace required more than military victory. Lieutenant Morrison, he called out as his horse came to a stop. The young officer straightened to attention, suddenly aware that his handling of the situation would be scrutinized by a superior with vastly more experience and presumably more wisdom. Sir, we have a group of Apache warriors in the town, apparently here to retrieve a deserter who has been living with the locals. Deserter? Colonel Webb's eyebrows rose as he took in the scene more carefully, noting the defensive but not overtly aggressive postures of all involved parties. That's an interesting choice of words, Lieutenant. Last I checked, Apache warriors weren't subject to military discipline. The correction was gentle but pointed, a reminder that jumping to conclusions could be dangerous in complex situations. Webb dismounted and approached Chief Nalnish with the measured respect of one veteran warrior acknowledging another. "Chief Nalnish," he said formally, "I heard reports of your death some years ago. I'm pleased to see they were greatly exaggerated." "Colonel Webb," the chief replied with equal formality, "your reputation for wisdom and fairness has reached even into the mountains where my people shelter. I hope that reputation is deserved." The exchange between the two leaders shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. These were not hot-headed young men eager for glory, but seasoned commanders who understood the true costs of warfare and the value of alternatives when they could be found. "Perhaps," Colonel Webb suggested, "we might discuss this situation in a more civilized manner. Miss Clearwater, would your tavern accommodate a gathering of all interested parties? I believe we have much to discuss." Martha looked around at the assembled crowd, Apache warriors, cavalry soldiers, townspeople, and at the center of it all, herself and Ayana, and realized that history was being made in the dusty streets of Esperanza. The decisions made in the next few hours could determine not just their personal fate, but the future of relations between two peoples who had been locked in conflict for generations. "Colonel," she said firmly, "my tavern has always been neutral ground where people could speak their minds and settle their differences peacefully. Tonight will be no exception." As the various groups began to move toward the tavern's welcoming lights, the simple wedding ring that would eventually symbolize Martha and Ayana's union still existed only in possibility. But the love it would represent had already proven itself stronger than prejudice, fear, and the terrible weight of history that pressed down on all their shoulders. The future remained unwritten, balanced on choices yet to be made, and courage yet to be summoned. But for the first time in years, that future held the promise of something better than endless cycles of violence and revenge.